It gives you the same exact thing without the song and dance of having a reducer and action and dispatchers. It's immediately global, there's no need for providers, right? You compare this to the amount of boilerplate and setup that you have to do for Redux. As I manipulate the state, you can see on the right. Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about Zustand. It's probably one of the simpler, most straightforward state management solutions in React. I'm sure you've probably heard of the useState and the useReducer hook, and even Redux. Maybe you've heard of recoil and stuff like that. A lot of those things are good solutions as well, but Zustand specifically stands out as one of the simpler solutions that you can just get up and running with, and I find it to be very intuitive, very easy to use. So with that said, let's just jump right in. Instead of me talking about what it is, I'm just going to show you how to use it, and I think you'll just find it very intuitive. I already have an existing basic skeleton app here from Create React App, and I'm just going to do that installation. I'm also just going to clean up some of this starter code. We don't really need this. And to get started, we're going to import create from that Zustand installation. So with that create method, you can create a store like so. And let's say that our store tracks state regarding puppies. Maybe we have a count of puppies and we want to be able to add a puppy. And to do that, we simply pass a function here which uses this set method that's being passed in as an argument there. All right, so what's going on here? We've got puppies, which is initialized to 0, and we've got an add puppy method, which simply just takes the initial state and then adds +1 to it. All right, so let's take a look at how we would utilize this in a component. We can extract the puppies like so, using our useStore hook that we just created. And within this useStore, you just pass in a selector function. So in this case, we're trying to select puppies out of this store. So we're gonna do state.puppies, right? And similarly, let's get the add puppy method. Same thing, right? We're gonna pass a selector method which selects state.add puppy. Then let's see this in action. We're gonna do let's print out the number of puppies, and then let's provide a basic button that allows us to increment the number of puppies. So we're just gonna pass in our add puppy method there, and we're gonna do add puppy. Let's go ahead and run this application and see how it looks. All right, so we got our number of puppies, and we should be able to add to it as I'm clicking this button. Pretty basic, nothing really complicated about that. So you might be wondering at this point, all right, I didn't really show you anything interesting. What is the point of this? And you can also imagine, you can just use useState, right? If you've used React useState, so you'd be able to do something like puppies, set puppies, and then you can do a useState like this, right? And initialize to 0. So that's the same exact thing, and you can use set puppies to add to it. Now, what's the benefit of Zustand in this case? Well, let's imagine that our state is a little bit more complex than just a basic property like that. Let's imagine that it also tracks the number of cats. So let's initialize the cats property to 0. All right, let's take a look at what we have. So I've updated my store to have a cats property and also pets. Pets is effectively tracking the combination of these two counts, puppies and cats. Or maybe in the future you could have other types of pets. We've got two methods which allows us to increment cats and puppies, and at the same time we're also going to be incrementing the state of the pets, so the total number of counts And then just so we can see that this is really working in action, we also added a method to delete puppies back down to 0. And then we're gonna see if we're able to still have our pet state be maintained properly. All right, and then next we simply selected all of those properties that we need to use. So we added cats, we added puppies, we added an ability to add cats and an ability to clear puppies. And then we updated our code here to have the cats and the pets count, and then a new add cats and a clear pups button. All right, let's take a look at how this looks. So just like before, I should be able to add puppies, and I can also add pups, or I'm sorry, I'm able to add cats. So you got 5 puppies, 5 cats, 10 pets total. And then if I clear pups, I expect that to go back down to 5 pets total. So let's debrief real quick what's so cool about the solution. Well, as you can see, anytime you have state that is sort of dependent or requires the value of another state, oftentimes that's very useful to do in some kind of reducer, or maybe you've seen doing that in the useReducer hook or Redux. In Zustand, we're able to do that, as you can see, in such a simple way without any of that complexity of setting up reducers or actions or dispatching or any of that stuff. In fact, to make a kind of quick comparison, right, let's write the equivalent reducer that we're going to use with useReducer hook to accomplish the same exact thing. So let me type that out real quick. All right, so what I typed out here is just a simple reducer that effectively does the same exact thing as our store over here. We have a way to increment puppies, we have a way to increment cats, and we have a way to clear puppies. And we also have an initial state object here, which just initializes everything to 0, same thing that's happening here. Now let's take a look at how we use this setup, this reducer with the useReducer. Now in React, if you're going to use the useReducer hook, you pass in your reducer and then you pass in your initial state. And what that brings back to you is the state as well as the dispatch. Now let's take a look at how we're going to use this same exact thing to accomplish what we have over here. Let's see if we can recreate this guy. In fact, let's mark this as Zustand so we know which one's which. And we're going to add useReducer over here. This now needs to be state.puppies, state.cats, and state.pets. Okay, and then we also need to change our buttons here. So usually the way you would do that is you would do a dispatch, and you have to provide a type, right? So that's the type that we're using in our reducer up here. So for example, to increment puppies, I need to provide a type of increment puppies. Okay, and then similarly, alright, so we have the same exact structure down here. And before we test this out, I actually noticed I missed a spread of state here. And now that we have that, let's go ahead and switch back to our browser just to make sure we have the same exact thing, right? So we can add puppies, I can add cats, 3 plus 3 equals 6. I can add puppies down here as well, and I can add cats. And just like how I can clear the pups back down to 3, I can clear the pups down here also back down to 3. Now let's compare sort of what's the difference, what's the pros and cons. Well, immediately you can notice that with reducers, that thing I just added is you always have to remember to merge the state by spreading it out like this, right? In Zustand, notice that I'm just changing individual properties, and I don't need to do any kind of manual merging because Zustand by default automatically merges the state. So that gives you the ability to change any one of these values individually, and it's not going to manipulate or accidentally overwrite the values of the other properties that you didn't touch, right? So that's one benefit. What's another benefit? Notice that with reducers, you have to deal with maintaining action types, and on top of that, you have this kind of extra abstraction of dispatching, right? Like you can't just create you don't have ready to use methods like we have here in Zustand. You have to dispatch an action, and typically in a more typical application, you'll also see this pattern in Redux. Sometimes people would put this into an action creator so that maybe you would have something like dispatch increment puppies, right, or something like that. So in this case with the useReducer, it definitely can do the same exact thing, but there's so many extra layers to it, right? And this comparison also applies to Redux, because with Redux you have the same exact patterns, right? So hopefully that makes sense to you. What the immediate benefit is that it gives you the same exact thing without the song and dance of having a reducer and action and dispatchers. Now there's also an extra benefit to Zustand, where let's imagine that you need to access your state globally. Usually that comes up in a scenario where maybe you have very heavy component nesting, and let's say that there's state at the top of the component tree, and then at the very bottom of that component tree the leaves need access to the state, right? So usually your only options there on a typical React application is either you prop drill, you keep passing the props all the way down until it's at the bottom of the tree, or what some people like to do is they introduce context, where the React also provides a use context and a way to provide that context down the tree. But again, for you to do that with Reducer, that means that you're going to be introducing, right? So here's the documentation for using context via the hooks API. You need to create the context, you need a provider, and then you have to do use context in any component that needs to use it. Now with Zustand, it's automatically global. It doesn't have to do any of that. So let's take a look. So I'm just gonna delete this reducer stuff because we don't really need it anymore. That was just for demonstration purposes. All right, so imagine that we're creating a nestable component, and to do that I'm just gonna create a basic component which is able to render children, and then actually I'm gonna move this stuff so that we can simulate showing that we can access this state anywhere. I'm gonna move that in here, wrap that in another div, and let's move all of our Zustand stuff over here. And for me to be able to access the store anywhere, what I'm gonna do is I am gonna move this store to a hook. I'm just gonna call that use store. It probably would have made sense for me to just call this use pet store, so let's do that. And this is also a point to explain, I guess, is that you can make as many stores as you want. This doesn't necessarily need to contain all of the information in your entire application. You can create individual stores to maintain individual slices of state for your application. Export default our use store, and then in our nested component I can import use pet store, and I'm just gonna change all of these to be use pet store. So how do we use this component? Well, what I wanted to kind of show off here is the ability to use this in a nesting way. So let's imagine that we pass in perhaps a level property, and we take that level and we just add padding, left padding, so that we can see the nesting visually. Maybe we do level times 10 pixels. All right, and then let's import our nested component. All right, so to see this in action, let's go ahead and start doing some nestings here, right? So we're basically gonna nest the component into itself, and we're gonna update the levels here so that we can see kind of the same way that it's nesting visually here, right? It should do the same thing in our browser. Now I do need to clean up the CSS a little bit. This is just the base CSS that came with Create React App. I don't want this to be center aligned. And also, actually, I made a mistake here. This should have been padding left. Maybe you caught that, maybe you didn't. But you can kind of see how visually on the browser itself we're seeing the nesting, right? And why don't we actually, let me increase the padding here just so it's a little bit more obvious. What happens when I try to manipulate the state? Notice that I have access to the state at any point in that component tree, right? Any one of these guys is able to manipulate the state. Any one of these guys is able to access and read that state. And they're also, notice that they're all reacting to the state. So something significant to notice here, right, is that I didn't have to introduce context. I didn't have to introduce a provider, right? As we saw in the example from the documentation, kind of like here, it just works. At any level in the component tree, I have access to that state, whether it's at the top or at the bottom. All you need is basically a reference to the store and your state selections, and your state is effectively global without providers. So that's pretty cool. So to me, to kind of summarize what I've gone over so far, to me it's pretty significant that it's so simple to create a store. There's no writing reducers or action creators, action types. It's immediately global. There's no need for providers. And in theory, you can share your state with other parts of your application that is not necessarily using React. So I hope you see the benefits here, and this is why I'm pretty excited about this solution in the React community, because it introduces a completely different way of managing state. And on top of that, it's just dead simple, right? You compare this to the amount of boilerplate and setup that you have to do for Redux, and there's just no comparison. Now, I think more complex applications could definitely benefit from that very structured way of maintaining state that Redux provides. But if you just have a simple object that you need to maintain and you just need to make it global, to me, I wouldn't even use contexts and reducers anymore. I would just go to Zustand. And if that ever gets complex, you can always switch over to Redux when you do get there. And the nice thing with Zustand is it's just not opinionated about how you do your state management. And in fact, if you do actually like that reducer pattern, so I switched the code back to what we had before, where we had the reducer and the store, the Zustand store side by side. So if you really like that reducer pattern, you can actually still use that with Zustand if you want. So for example, instead of us doing this method here, using the set method, you can actually replace this with a dispatch, and you'll notice that we pass in our reducer in here. And what does that allow us to do? Well, you can still select your state like this, but we're gonna change these guys to be dispatch. And then what we're actually gonna do is we're gonna take our dispatchers down here, I'm gonna move it up here, and let's delete this code. And I'm also gonna delete this useReducer, right? So we effectively kind of just merged the two strategies, right? And if we go to our browser, it should still work. We got 5 + 5 = 10, clear pups, and back to 5 pets, right? It works the exact same way. So the nice thing with Zustand, right, again, is that it's just not opinionated. You can do it however you want. You can keep it simple based on I think the one we had originally was much simpler than introducing a reducer and a dispatch like this. But this gives you a bridge to, let's say that you start with this pattern and then one day your state gets complex enough that you maybe decide, oh, I want to switch over to Redux. Well, guess what? The reducer that you will have still will work the same exact way in Redux. So it's kind of it gives you a bridge to switch over to Redux if you really need to. Or if you were using maybe a useReducer and a use context combo, you could eliminate the context and just take your reducer, put it into Zustand, and you'll have the same exact thing, right? right? In this example, you could also, you saw we had an initial state object here. If you like having it in a separate object, you should be able to just spread it out like that. And then another thing to mention is that Zustand actually comes with a couple different middlewares that are ready to use. So for example, a cleaner way to achieve this rather than trying to create our own dispatcher method here is you can do a Redux middleware that they already have from Zustand/middleware. And how this works is you just replace this whole thing with your Redux middleware, and you pass in your reducer, and you pass in your initial state. And again, if we take a look, this functions the same exact way, right? So cleans it up even more. You can even use Redux DevTools if you want. You can do DevTools, another middleware that they have, and you can simply just add it to your composition here, right? We're wrapping DevTools with Redux, and I don't think you necessarily need to do the Redux middleware. Like, you can use the usual store and just use the DevTools against that. But what's really cool about this is, so then what I can do is on the Chrome Web Store, I can install Redux DevTools, going back to the application and opening that side by side with Redux DevTools. As I manipulate the state, you can see on the right, we were tracking our actions, and then we can see what's going on with the state, how it changed, what was the action that got dispatched, and what's the current view of that state. All right, so I don't want to make this video any longer. It really is that simple. And this is, if you're a React developer, you absolutely should have Zustand in your back pocket as one of your tools. There's a couple other things in here that are worth mentioning. For example, there's a couple other middleware. So for example, it comes with a nice persist middleware if you want to save some state in session storage or local storage. It's got good support for that. It does also provide a way for you to do selecting an object, kind of like if you know how to use map state to props in Redux. They have a pattern for that. You just got to make sure that you add this shallow check. And it also has support for async actions, so kind of similar to Redux thunks, if you're familiar with that. Now, it is worth mentioning that it's not all good things, right? There's definitely some cons, and one of those I would say is because Zustand manages state outside of React. What that effectively means is in your unit test, there's a scenario where if you don't catch it, it will actually share the state between your tests. Because, right, if you imagine the Zustand state is over here and React's over here, as you unit test your React app, the state gets shared in all your tests. But a good thing is they do have some documentation for how to handle that, and the gist of it is basically you got to mock out Zustand in your tests so that you can see that you're able to basically reset the store per test. So not a big deal. Good thing they have it documented. All right, guys, that's really it. I hope you found this video useful. Again, something that I think everyone in React should know about. If you don't like the Zustand approach, there's also Jotai that you might want to check out. It's actually from the same author. That's a different approach that I'll talk about maybe another video comparing that with Zustand. But to me, Zustand is a must-have, especially if you're coming from the land of Redux. You absolutely should know that this solution exists. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, give me some feedback. A lot of people have been giving me some good comments, and I use that to help improve my content. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, maybe I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.